So welcome. We are so excited to have you. My name is Maddie Duke, and on behalf of ABA Technologies, I want to thank you for being here today. At ABA Technologies, we help small and medium-sized companies who have specific performance problems by making sure that employees know what to do, so we build better training, and by making sure that they do it. In the context of today's webinar, we are talking about RBT training. A little bit about our presenter. Adam Hoffman is the Senior Vice President of Learning Partnerships and Growth at ABA Technologies. And as one of our instructional designers, Adam focuses on integrating innovative and educational technologies and instructional design methods into our expanding range of products. Adam plays a pivotal role in building learning and performance systems, as well as corporate training programs that enhance professional capabilities. His background includes valuable work developing educational technologies in private school settings and for pediatric cancer patients. Without any further delay, let's get going.
Thank you, Maddie, and excited to have all of you here to continue our webinar series that has been about the RBT 3.0 standards with the BACB. And today we're going to talk about a particularly important component as you make that shift to 3.0, which is assessment. And of course, assessment, something you can do, assessment of your training systems, of the performance of your employees is something you can do at any point. But this is a really good point, because if you're going to be making changes to meet the 2026 standards updates, this is an opportunity to make some thoughtful decisions based on what's going on in your company and where you really might have some gaps that not only can you layer in the BACB requirements, but some other tools that can help you make the most of the training that you're going to be doing. So I'm going to be talking about assessment today, and we're going to specifically talk about measurement inside of assessment and evaluation. As Maddie mentioned, this is our third webinar in this RBT series. We have a monthly webinar going on from now through the end of the year that will talk about either something related to RBT training or RBT supervision, mostly focused on the 3.0 changes. We'll also be talking about professional development changes. And so make sure that you look out, follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook, as well as stay connected through our newsletter. We're sending out resources through that and letting you know about updates and future webinars. We're planning our one for August. And in the chat, Maddie's going to drop a link to a form where you can give us some advice on what the topic should be for future webinars. There are a lot of things we could talk about with RBT training, but we want to make sure that they're relevant to you. We're also offering, we started these at our last webinar, we're offering free 30-minute learning consults. And Maddie will put a link in the chat for this as well. It takes you to my Calendly page, and I've really enjoyed talking with folks of different size companies, some people who are just beginning. I talked to a organization that is launching their company in August, all the way to people who've been around for a really long time and want some advice on making that 3.0 switch. We are offering a discounted discovery process. We do a full discovery where we look at your entire curriculum, look at your training systems, come out and do a site visit. And because we know people are preparing for the 3.0 changes, we're doing a truncated, discounted version of that to help you make that shift. And during the 30-minute consult, happy to talk about that, as well as anything else you want to talk about related to your training systems. And one of the things that a lot of people are interested in doing is reducing the number of overall training hours. You know you need to meet that 40-hour requirement, but you also don't want to inflate those with hours of having people go through an online, a fully asynchronous 40-hour online training and go through instructor-led training and in vivo hours and so on and so forth. It can really inflate your total time. So we have a 40-hour training that we've sold for years, over 10 years, and we're updating it with the 3.0 standards. But we also work with organizations on customizing it, tailoring it so that you can use these 5 modules and conduct everything else through ILTs. Or maybe you want to go into a module like reinforcement and you only want to teach free operant and MSWO and you don't want to teach the other preference assessments, or you want to do a lighter touch on those in your ILT, so we can move those over there. So we're happy to help you work through that so that you can get to those 40 hours and then use anything else on top of that. Make sure that it's really practice-based, really working on the skills that technicians are going to need in practice. And as many of you know, there's also a new professional development requirement for the BACB. And so in order to meet that professional development requirement, we're really recommending that you do something other than offering a bunch of one-off CEs like you would if you were, if you were offering CEs for your BCBAs, but do something that's more in-depth, more skills and practice focused. And we have a whole series that's focused on that, our ProTech product, which has some short lessons on focused topics. And then we embed those topics within supervision meetings. We embed them within team meetings and in things that you're doing in practice. And coming soon, we are going to be launching a podcast. We're very excited about this with Michael Fabrizio and Rose Fedek from ABA Compliance Solutions. They're two BCBAs, longtime BCBAs who have turned compliance experts, and they are fantastic at working on all variety of compliance issues for small and mid-sized companies. And so they've got a ton of resources, including a checklist they gave us for our first webinar, which is just a review of what you need to make sure is in place with your training system to meet those 3.0 requirements. So we're looking forward to having them have this podcast in place. I know compliance isn't always a sexy topic, but they're really smart, and I'm really looking forward to listening to this when it comes out. So now let's jump into today's webinar, which is focused on assessment. And again, in the chat, we'd love for you to fill out that Google form, which will give us some ideas around topics you want to hear in future webinars. And if you want to sign up for a free learning consult, you can do that on that. You can go ahead and click through and find a time on my Calendly. And if that doesn't work for you, you can fill out the form and we'll contact you if you want to invite other people. All right, so let's talk about assessment. Conducting assessments, conducting and looking at the measurements you are collecting on your training system before you start taking action, before you actually go in and make a bunch of changes to your system and you start messing with what's working to try to meet those requirements. So we're going to do a quick review of the 2026 changes. We did a whole hour-long webinar in May about this, and you can find it on YouTube or you can find it on our social media. Then we're going to go into some basics about measurement and learning and development, or L&D. A lot of people in ABA that conduct training, either training directors, clinical directors, trainers, maybe at the chief clinical officer level, regional director level, a lot of people who supervise training come from an ABA background and not so much from a learning and development background. And so there are certain practices in assessment, measurement, and evaluation in learning and development that are very helpful. And many ABA practitioners are not often exposed to those types of practices. So I'm going to introduce a framework on how to kind of get all the measures that are available to you synthesized into one place and report it, so you can be informed about what's going on with your system, but also other stakeholders in the company. Then we're going to talk about some common ABA training and onboarding metrics that you probably are already collecting. And in many of the organizations we work with, we find that they have access to a lot of these measures. They just aren't all in one place. They have no scorecard. They have no dashboard. The information is not being synthesized in one place. It's kind of all over the place, and it doesn't really communicate what they wanted to communicate to other people in the company. Then they can't answer important research questions like, do technicians who receive more hours of training have better procedural fidelity scores? They can't answer that really because all their data are everywhere. So we're going to talk about some of those metrics, and you can kind of check, or see what's missing that might be easily added. And then we're going to talk about some strategies for collecting other information during this phase of making these bigger shifts. All right. So let's start with a review of the 2026 changes. And I'm only pulling the changes that are relevant to kind of the training curriculum. So in the 2023 newsletter, the BACB announced that there were going to be changes that were going to be implemented at the start of 2026. And then subsequent documentation had information about things like changes in the number of hours of training and how they get allocated. So it's still a 40-hour training, but now it's dedicated to different sections within a curriculum outline. No longer is it just a task list and it's 40 hours and you try to cover all of you cover all of it. It doesn't matter how long it takes. Now we have to put each of those different task items into different buckets. Okay. The task list went away, but now there's the test content outline, and that's got tasks that are grouped into these content areas. And for each content area, there's more detail about what the curriculum needs to cover. Okay. It adds up to 38 with two discretionary hours at the end. And that training, that dedicated training, not only needs to meet those curriculum requirements, but also needs to be training that's based on a number of best practices in training. Whether it's in person or online, it needs to have components of, it could have components of video-based instruction, like video models of how to implement procedures. It could have didactic classroom-based instruction. It could have components of behavioral skills training. There might be quizzes with feedback in there. There might be interactive activities like implementing a teaching procedure and getting feedback on that. It might be doing a role play and having a discussion or a debrief on that role play. Those are sort of the elements of the active, high quality training that you want to make sure are in place. Okay. So those are the elements, the tactics that you use to meet the content area requirements here that are shown on screen. And then a little bit is changing with the exam. Okay. The total number of questions is staying the same, but the allocations are different. The allocations and the number of tasks there, for example, the number of tasks in the third edition for ethics is double from what it was in 2.0. Okay. And then finally, there's that professional development requirement that every certification cycle, the technician is receiving 12 hours of continuing ed. And that's something that you as an organization can provide. You can provide that continuing education. But again, what I encourage you to do is not think, oh, can we get a 1 hour CE on a Friday and throw something together? But actually make it something that's about, we've identified this performance issue. We're going to do some professional development on it, and then we're going to provide wraparound supports with it. We're going to not only make sure that that initial training has some practice and feedback in it, but we're going to follow up. We're going to get some of our supervisors to go out and monitor and give feedback. We're going to bring back those examples for further discussion. We're going to maybe make some process or systems changes based on the performance of our technicians, okay? You're having this whole wraparound system of looking in, continuous improvement, of looking in, making changes, trying things out, looking in again, coming back out on an ongoing basis. Don't let this fall stagnant, okay? And those changes are implemented at the beginning of January 2026. So you'll be making sure that you have those things in place so that people go and sit for the exam. And when they sit for the exam, they're ready to test under the new exam, okay? So that's a quick fire review of some of the elements that you'll find when you go in and read that newsletter. If you are overtraining, you have to go read the newsletter and all of those manuals that are all the documentation that accompanies them, because you're responsible for making sure that all of that's happening. Especially, we see a lot of people who sign their names as responsible trainers on certificates, and they don't really know whether the training program has all those elements in it. They've never really looked at it. So if you are the responsible trainer on the certificate, you really want to make sure, because they're practicing under your certification, all right, or they're being trained under your certification. Okay, so those are the changes that are sort of the context for as you're making this shift. It's already a good time to do some cleanup in terms of what you're measuring, so that you can use those measures to do some diagnostics, to assess what's going on, what's working, what isn't, where do we have gaps, what can we intervene on. And now I'm going to go into some measurement basics. And I'm pulling from a framework that comes from the ROI Institute. They are an organization that's focused on putting out some thought leadership, some different frameworks and training related to working with organizations on getting a return on their investment from a variety of initiatives. And they've developed this beautiful, simple framework called the Talent Development Reporting Principles Framework, or TDR, small p, Principles Framework. And all of this is described in detail in this book called Measurement Demystified. If you're responsible for training and you don't know a lot about assessment, measurement, and evaluation, this is a really good primer on that. It kind of deep dives into some areas and may give you some ideas around how to improve your overall measurement strategy, especially if you're responsible for certain KPIs in your organization that relate to training and supervision. So here's sort of the high level of this framework, and then I'm going to break it apart into and kind of relate it to some things in ABA. All right. So the way that this framework is established is based on the assumption that there are 4 reasons that people measure things in an organization. And in this framework, they're talking about talent development, training professionals who measure things like training, performance, supervision, outcomes of training. But there are 4 reasons that they measure. The first is to inform And those are data that we may take a high, just they're just giving us information of what's going on. We're getting a general picture of what's happening. We may have a bunch of metrics kind of all synthesized in a scorecard, and we're looking at those. Monitor, where we maybe compare it against a benchmark, evaluate and analyze, where we can make some decisions, and manage, where we're actually using metrics to help us make certain business and clinical decisions. Those, I'm going to break those down a little bit more, but those are the reasons that then we go in and collect measures. And the types of measures that you collect, like how long it takes technicians to go through training, or how long it takes them to complete training before their first billable hour. All of those different measures fit into three general categories: outcome measures, effectiveness, and efficiency measures. Okay. And those measures, we then make decisions about how we're going to use those to either they're just measures that we're going to watch, like we're going to inform, or we're going to actually go in and deep dive into them and answer important questions by connecting those measures together. And in order to do that, there are different ways of reporting. You could put it together in a scorecard format or a dashboard. And usually when it's in that format, it's just so we can get a big zoomed out 30,000 view of what's going on in the organization. And then there are other types of reports that you might produce to answer specific questions or inform certain stakeholders. What I like about this framework is that in its simplicity, it's very similar to how other functions in a company work. So finance, operations, HR, they do similar types of reporting. They gather similar types of measures. But we don't have as robust measures going on in a lot of the ABA training, clinical training function, okay? And so by kind of adopting this framework, it's easy for you to take all those measures, package them, and then present them in ways that other leaders in the company are presenting them, okay? And one of the things that we talk about in learning and development is making learning and development not just a training function that anytime someone needs to get trained, we just throw them to a trainer, or anytime a training needs to get created, we just say, hey, we need you to create this 1 hour training on X topic, okay? We try to avoid that because we know that training, and we know that the other things that people who work in training, the other kinds of performance interventions that they can often design and implement, are very effective at changing employee performance in a way that's going to improve certain very important business and clinical outcomes. But not always are training directors and training leaders in organizations viewed as someone who can be that strategic partner. And if you take the information that you already have coming in from your LMS and the information that your trainers gather, things that you get from procedural fidelity, data sheets, information you get from supervisors, qualitative information, if you take all of that and synthesize it and put it into this framework, it makes you a very useful person. It makes you a very useful training professional in the organization who can actually provide a lot of important insights to other metrics that the organization's tracking. So that's really why I like this framework. Let's dive into each of those levels just a little bit more. So the three main measures that we're collecting are outcomes, effectiveness, and efficiency. And you probably have, there's a chance you have hundreds of measures out there on different aspects of these that would fit into these three categories. Just because you measure it doesn't mean that one, you need to, and two, that you need to look at it. So there may be measures that you're collecting that are automatically collected. You've got them as part of your portfolio of measurements, but you're not going to actually look at them on a regular basis, okay? So efficiency is answering that question of how much, okay? Those are sort of the operational numbers, like how many RBTs did we train this quarter, okay? Or how long does it take them to get through onboarding, or how many supervision hours did we deliver? And those measures kind of let you understand resource use and throughput, even though it may not give you a good indicator of capacity. Then there's effectiveness, and that's a little bit deeper. And it's not just how many did we train this month, but how well did we do it? Okay, so these are the measures that look at quality. And so those might be things like post-test scores. It might be procedural fidelity scores. It could be the competency assessments. It could be scores on the RBT BACB exam. And that gives us not just whether something happened, but did it meet the desired outcome? Are the competencies that we say training is accomplishing? Are we seeing that on procedural fidelity checks? Are we seeing that in practice? And then there's outcome measures, and that's kind of what has changed as a result of doing training or doing performance interventions or other initiatives in the organization. And that's sort of the harder part, but that's really where the value is. because those measures can tell you whether the initiative made a difference. For example, if you implement a new supervision process to reduce turnover, that would be an example. That turnover rate would be an example of an outcome measure. Even though you maybe, let's say, implemented it on the efficiency, we've got a tracking how many supervision meetings we were tracking every month. Now we can relate to that to something that's more impactful for the organization. Okay. A similar type of thing, did the technicians' procedural fidelity scores correlate with client progress? Okay. Or if we look at authorizations, we look at feedback from funders, what is the result of the training, connecting the training metric and also the practice metric of collecting procedural fidelity? So all of these kind of link together, and you want to make sure that you've got a few measures that are in each of these buckets. At the training, if you're a training director level, you may not have insight or you may not be part of all the discussions that are related to outcomes. So you have to kind of get your act together on collecting the efficiency and effectiveness measures first so that you can contribute and give useful insights to that outcomes conversation. So that talks about those three different types of measures there. And now the reasons for conducting those measures. And that's what the framework really tries to help you do. It tries to anchor the measures that you have with the types of reports based on the reason people want those measures. So the first one at the very bottom of the list is inform. And those are more of those exploratory measures. They can help you spot trends or kind of surface some questions. But this is usually like a big report, like a scorecard where you've got lines of different measures that get updated on a monthly or quarterly cadence, or a dashboard that automatically updates. And so that might be, you might have everything in there from average time it takes to complete onboarding to session cancellation rates. And it's not that you're necessarily setting a target to change any of those things, but they're just informing you of what you have access to and what's going on in the organization. Then from that kind of laundry list, you have some of those measures you might actually zoom in and look at. Those might be what you monitor, which is the next level. Okay. And those are what you're actually looking at with some level of intent. So it might be that you have a benchmark set against one of those targets, like 80% of staff should be completing X number of overlaps within their first 30 days. And so if that number dips below that, whatever that threshold is, then you know that item is something you may want to take a closer look at. At the monitor phase, a lot of these kinds of scorecards, you'll often do a yellow or green, yellow, red kind of system. So you mark them so you know which ones you need to look at. And then you can take that shorter list of metrics and pull those again to do the evaluate and analyze, which is the next level. And that's where you're starting to connect the dots. You're starting to ask some research questions like, is the time spent in overlaps or the time spent in some sort of shadowing or nesting protocol, does that correlate to lower rates or higher rates on fidelity checks? Are staff receiving performance feedback on a regular weekly cadence? Does that impact how long they stay in the organization? Okay. Those are the measures where we start to pull those effectiveness and efficiency insights together, and they start to give us a lot of information, usually at the process level. And then finally, manage. And that's where the data you're collecting can really help other leaders in the organization. You're using these measures, and it can help you guide planning and track progress toward organizational outcomes. Like if you have some yearly goals that are set, and you want to reduce a gap by, let's say, 10 or 20%, on some metric, that's where all that information could be helpful. And so each of these reasons for measuring, we use different types of measures for each of these. Kind of zooming out, we've got inform, where it's kind of everything that we can get our hands on, and then we zoom in to look at the ones that are going to make the most difference on the questions that we want to answer. The reason that I like this kind of line of reasoning here, right there, inform, monitor, evaluate, analyze, and manage, is because sometimes when people show scorecards or dashboards with all the metrics that they have, it is truly all the metrics that they have, and they're taking that dashboard and then trying to go in and trying to do deeper analysis. And they end up making a lot of false assumptions because they're looking at data that they think is telling them a story that isn't. And some of the strategies I'm going to talk about in a moment are less about gathering more metrics and more about putting all those metrics together in a narrative that people in the organization can understand, supervisors can understand, that I can create a narrative about what's going on in the organization, take it to a new hire, take it to a senior BT. I can share that narrative with them. They can fill in the gaps, and I'm going to find a lot of holes that I didn't realize I had from just looking at the measures on a dashboard or some graphs. All right. So we've talked about the bottom two levels, which are the reasons you measure, and then the types of measures you use. And now we're going to talk about how you actually report those. And you can see at the very top where it says scorecards and dashboards, those are the two reporting formats that are often used when you are at the informing or monitoring stage. So let's look at these. Some of these you probably already have, even if they're not super organized, but these are the 5 types of reports that this framework talks about. The first one is a scorecard, and that's usually a simple table where you've got rows for different metrics, and you update it at some cadence, like every month or on a quarterly basis. And it's great for spotting trends. I talked a moment ago about color coding some of those items, some of the metrics that are maybe hitting below your whatever established benchmarks you have. Then there's the dashboard, and the dashboard is usually larger organizations have the resources to put these together where they're sourcing information from a lot of different systems. So you've got your HRIS, you've got information that's coming in from intake and scheduling, you've got information that's coming in from your learning management system, your trainers, you've got scores that are coming in from exams and so forth. So you've got all that data, and usually the dashboard is automatically updated. And then it gives you a lot of visualization options. You can turn things into a bar graph, and you can turn it into a line graph. You can show the relationship between two measures that you've got going on. Okay. And it's kind of a quick snapshot. And some companies have those. I'm sure some people enjoy them, KPI meetings, but usually they're dreaded meetings where you just sit and you go through every last metric that you could possibly get your hands on and try to come up with some solution. Okay. And then usually they become these report out meetings. Everybody hates them. Nobody actually walks away with making a decision except for when things are really going south. So, not to get off on that, but that's one of the ways that dashboards get used. But dashboards can actually be helpful when you strip down the information to the metrics that you most need to focus on. And in a moment, we're going to talk about what metrics come out of training and onboarding and where you need to put your attention. But there are ways to set up those metrics so that they can give you a visual snapshot of how things are going. And then you can start to say, ooh, we want to focus on these 3 metrics for the next 6 months. And this is how we're going to track those. And here's where we're going to do a little bit more of a deeper dive. Okay. Then next are 3 kind of like custom reports, or reports that you put together by gathering relevant measures together to answer some sort of question or inform some stakeholder group. So if one of them is a program evaluation report. So if you're implementing RBT 3.0, you've made big changes to your system. All right, now we're going to have this report. We're going to say, how did RBT training go over the last 6 months? Okay. So we put together sort of a program evaluation report, and that report gives us information about that specific initiative, our RBT 3.0 initiative, or you put in some supervisor training, or you put in some supervisor mentorship program. Okay. And that's going to tell us, are we working toward our objectives for this one program? A custom analysis report is something you can pull together if you want to answer a very specific question. Like, we want to know the relationship between the number of shadow and overlap hours and how that relates to staff retention or some other outcome. Okay. And so you can kind of pull those together and then gather additional insights to inform. And then finally, there's the management report. And that's usually where you're stripping down the information, giving the most critical targets so that you can inform leaders who are not deep in the work. And so often when people report out in kind of leadership meetings where there are people who are uninformed about the work, they dive into the wrong details. They spend a lot of time talking about things that then confuse people who don't actually know the work. Okay. So this would be like going to a leadership meeting and reporting out on something that's going on in training and talking about how we have to change 100 slides and all the slides need these new task items on there, and we have to move things around, and we have to create new files, and we got to train the trainers on how to implement the new decks, and we've got to work with our 40-hour training provider, and we've got to update that. And it's way too much detail. And you end up looking like a mess who doesn't know what's going on with the things that other leaders are going to care about. Like, these are the three metrics we're monitoring. Here's how we're meeting them. These are our goals, and here's our progress towards those. So a lot less information, then dive into the details if needed. Okay. So it's like the reverse funnel. Start at the top with the big picture headline that they can get in one sentence, and then strip down to more of the nuance and the details. Okay. So that summarizes that kind of dives into the types of measures and reports that you can produce. And again, a lot of the measures that you need in order to inform the assessment of your current training system and changes you need to make are already things that you have your hands on. You just need to put them in the right kind of format. You need to put them in a scorecard. You need to put them in a dashboard. And if you don't have those metrics, if you don't have them all pulled together, a good place to start is at the scorecard level. Start by creating a spreadsheet that's got all of your metrics, even if you're not updating them regularly. Start there so you can just kind of get a sense of where we're at, current state, where are all of our measures. Like, you may have outcomes on, for example, time to complete on the 40-hour training. That's coming from a learning management system. Other information about attendance to instructor-led training is coming from trainers. Information about competency assessment is coming from a supervisor or a trainer and is being inputted into a spreadsheet. Okay. Get one scorecard spreadsheet that tells you these are the metrics that we have. What other information do we need to inform our assessment of what's going on and what needs to change? And so now we're going to go into some measures that you probably have access to, training and onboarding metrics that you have access to, or you could easily get access to. And I've broken these into a couple of different categories. We're going to start with training metrics. And if you go out and look at the learning and development literature, you'll see a lot of these. These are very common metrics that we track in L&D. One is time to completion, which is now a composite score that tells us the average amount of time that it takes for a technician to complete a full training. And that may be just the 40 hours, and maybe 40 hours plus ILTs plus competency assessments and other internal onboarding activities. Okay. It's where you can spot delays. It's where you can spot bottlenecks in the training system. And it's also a good metric that will show you whether or not you're planning out things like your remediation to prepare them for the BACB exam. The second metric is course completion rate. And that works hand in hand with time to completion. Okay. So you've got sort of your percentage and your time-based metrics there. And this refers to the percentage of techs that have finished the full training program once they've started. And that directly relates to your drop-off or abandonment rate, which is looking at at what point in the onboarding sequence do trainees drop off. They either pause their training, like sometimes we have organizations that do their 40 hours while concurrent with shadowing. And so they'll start going through their modules, but then they'll start shadowing and then they stop. That's kind of their drop off after the third or fourth module in the training, but they keep coming to the sessions for the shadows. And so that can tell you a lot of information about what kinds of supports you need to put in there. Maybe you need to redo the sequence. Maybe you need to redo the schedule for onboarding. You need to chunk the asynchronous modules and shadowing the smaller sections. Maybe you need to add accountability checks to make sure that people are staying on track. Okay. You can also look at abandonment rate. Like, here we brought on these 20 technicians or these 3 technicians, and here's the point at which they drop off. And during your exit interviews, you can gather qualitative insights that you can pair with the drop off or abandonment rate. Learner satisfaction scores, those usually come from some sort of satisfaction survey that you conduct at the end of your training. And you can parse that survey. It's helpful to have it across the different aspects of training, like our online training, our instructor-led, supervision contacts, overlaps, first days on the job, those types of things. These are often surveys. That's the easiest way to collect them. Surveys that might have Likert scale questions on them, but can also have open-ended fields where you can gather insights. And if you're a smaller organization, and I've been meeting with some small organizations that aren't bringing in that many technicians per month, which is, it makes it a lot easier to run the training system. So you might have more capacity to do things like sit down and do a satisfaction kind of interview. Okay. The net promoter score, this is that one question measure that says, how likely are you to recommend this training to someone else? While it's not super informative of a lot of aspects of what you need to do in training, it can be helpful because you can use that Your recruitment teams can use that when they are hiring people. It's also going to give you an indicator of what will people say when you've got new hires who are going out on the job and working with current techs. If you've got a low net promoter score, there's a higher probability that when a new hire says, well, what's it like working around here? Or what do you think of training? That they may have negative reactions to it, and that may influence your abandonment rate for technicians, for your new hires. And then engagement rate. And that's sort of a look at how engaged, can sometimes just be a stagnant measure, like you're counting the number of active response opportunities that are in an online training, or the number of activities that we deliver during our ILT, or number of activities that we deliver during our overlaps, like worksheets that people have to complete, IOA, that type of thing. Then there are metrics that you can complete related to shadowing and then moving into overlaps and session delivery. So shadowing hours completed before the session. And that's just a simple metric. How many shadowing hours did the technician complete before they had their first hands-on session that was supervised? The second one is shadowing variety. So this can be a composite number of different types of shadowing experiences. And to create the shadowing variety metric, the thing that you have to do is kind of establish as an organization what we're going to count as changes in variety. So if you're a clinic-based setting and you've got children who are ages 3 through 8 in that setting, and you've got a variety of learning profiles in there, and I'll just take communication modalities as one. So you've got a more advanced language user, and you've got one with minimal language, or maybe using a very low-tech AAC system. Those are two different types of shadowing opportunities. The technicians are going to be engaged in different performances, some of the same performances in both of those settings, but also different ones. And so if you provide shadowing across those opportunities, that might be 2 points towards variety. They've had two different unique experiences to show them the range of possibilities of clients that they could work with. Now, if you're hiring a technician to work with this specific client, that may not be as a useful measure. However, there are many organizations that bring in technicians and they plan for them to work with a client, and then they realize that that's a bad match, but they would be better suited to work with B client, and they don't want to turn them away. So they kind of make those shifts on the job. So shadowing variety, that as a metric can be useful to say, on the whole, when we have organization and we're bringing in new technicians who are shadowing and then starting to go through training, their shadowing opportunities are pretty limited in variety, and that's not matching what we're doing in ILTs and in our asynchronous training, which is one of the reasons why we see a lot of issues in generalization of some of those procedural skills on the job, because what they're seeing in training is often matched to only one or a couple of learner profiles that are not represented with what they're seeing in practice. Okay. All right. And then activity completion and accuracy during overlap. So that is, if I have you go out and do an observation and you're collecting IOA and you're going to turn that IOA data sheet into me at the end, and you're going to do a debrief with me, or we're going to do a check on it, or I'm going to, score it in some way. It could be the completion of those structured activities. Those structured activities can be used to count toward those in vivo experiences, can be used to count toward your 40 hours. But having this metric in place is really important, because the more that you split up your training system into different training modalities where you're accruing hours from different methods, the more risk that you have in not accurately counting all those hours and summarizing them correctly to ensure people have been compliant and completed the whole training. And then a recall accuracy and pace of the overlap observation. I like this one. I talk about this in a little bit, a free say or a free write, or you have structured questions that you ask them. And this one gets them to verbalize some of the things that they observed in the session. What did they watch people model? What did they did? Can they describe those procedures in a technological way? Does that relate to the level of training that they've received in your instructor-led trainings or ILTs and your asynchronous training? Are there gaps in that? And that can be useful information to improve your system. Then there are metrics related to overlaps and session delivery. And those overlaps are where you're increasing the amount of responsibility that that technician has in what they're doing with the client and with the technician they're working alongside. And so those metrics can be things like procedural fidelity scores or areas of improvement. And procedural fidelity scores, those are, of course, you can have your procedural fidelity checklist and you gather that information, you summarize those, you get a composite score, and then you have a place where you can report it. You have a reporting system so that that can be a metric that gets brought into your scorecard or into your dashboard. If you don't have such a system in place, or if it's way too complex and you're observing one thing when you look at procedural fidelity data and you're seeing another thing when you go in practice, you can strip that back to the things that you have the capacity to collect. Okay. And I've talked about this in the last webinar, or at least maybe the last two webinars, this issue of just having way too many things you're trying to track. All right. And one of the ways that you can do that, one of the ways that I think is very simple, but is very powerful, is the teacher performance rate and accuracy scaler, the TPRA, that comes out of Doug Greer and colleagues' work out of the CABIS model. The way that that is structured and the tactics that align when you have errors in the antecedent or consequence components is very helpful. It can drive a lot of the interventions and that you provide at an individual level and that you provide to people in training. So take a look at the TPRA. Areas of improvement, that's a metric that you can look at the number of areas of improvement and the type of improvement area that you've given someone. So similar, and this is kind of related to that TPRA and what they do in that CABIS system. But I know my colleagues at Organization for Research and Learning, Michael Fabrizio, Allison Moores, Kelly Ferris, for many years when they started their practice, they started doing those live observations, short observations, often of technicians and people who are implementers of procedures. They would do the observation, they would be scoring it, they would be collecting some fidelity data on it, they would also be collecting some rate data on certain instructional behaviors. And then at the end of it, regardless of what the scores were, they would only select a couple of areas of improvement. Because if you've got 10 things you're tracking and the technician is weak on all of those, you need to trim that down to a couple of things that they can focus on. Either you can focus on in training and mentorship and coaching, or that you can use to direct how you're going to proceed with subsequent observations. And so those areas of improvement might be like reinforcer delivery was late, okay, or unclear SDs. And maybe that's happening consistently. There are other things, of course, that might be going on that aren't great, but let's say those are the two things we're going to focus on. You've got two improvement areas, you've got a score of 2 there, and here are the types. You've got an error in your antecedent category and an error in the consequence category. By using this metric, you can look at not only how many areas of improvement are there in observations and by observation periods, but you can also look at how you categorize those. That can give you can wrap that up to give a lot of information to what you're doing in training and supervision. And then when you do professional development opportunities, that feeds, that ties this whole loop together, that we know these are the specific areas of improvement, rather than saying, oh gosh, procedural fidelity scores are very low for this group of technicians or for this site or for the organization as a whole. This really starts to focus the things that you can change, okay? Which is what you want to, these are the metrics that are live. They're the leading indicators that are useful to you that you can actually make decisions on at the training level. And then there are assessments and evaluations. And these are the types of things that you collect sometimes from your learning management system, like a pre and post-test scores. Maybe it's implementing a competency assessment and you're looking at the scores on those. Maybe it's time to proficiency. So how many retakes or how long, how many days or how many hours of training does it take to become proficient at a particular skill or to pass a particular test? You could also be tracking first time and reattempts at an exam, like a mock exam. If I were in an organization and I was paying for somebody to go through the RBT exam, I would be conducting a mock exam first to identify areas of improvement, and I would be correlating that score with their RBT BACB exam. Okay. Both, it tells me not to spend the money when they're not ready, but it could also tell me information about where am I seeing, is my exam not matching the BACB exam? Is it too easy? Are the scores really inflated on that exam? and much lower on the BACB exam? Is the reverse happening? Are they pretty similar? Is it a good predictor? Should I go with other predictors of on training to know whether they're ready? So those are some of the metrics that you can collect from assessments that both you conduct, but also that you get from that are automatically collected when people complete an assessment. And then the last one is percentage correct on critical questions. So just like in safety, when we have a safety checklist, there may be a lot of things that are on there, but there are these 3 high flyer items. And if you miss these 3 items, then it's a complete fail because those could get someone killed. Okay. Same type of thing here is that there are certain critical questions or critical items that if you get these things wrong, we absolutely have to do remediation on them. We can't just let them go. Things like safety, things like ethics. Okay. And then the last one is satisfaction. And these could be trainer satisfaction. I talked about this earlier. So surveys that gather data. It could also be that satisfaction in the way of things like you ask questions where people do self-reflection, like how confident am I after completing this training? Or how confident am I in implementing X, Y, and Z? Okay, was there content that was clear and useful? Did you feel supported during the onboarding experience? And then the supervisor satisfaction scores. Getting information about putting those new techs on the job, information that's maybe tells you I had to spend a lot more time with these techs on these 3 skills, okay? Or I'm having to spend a lot of time on these professionalism skills that weren't tackled in the clinical training, okay? So all of those are different types of metrics that you can get. And we're going to send out in the follow-up email to people who registered for the webinar, we'll send a resource list and I will put in a handout of these slides so that you can see those metrics in there, all right? But they all kind of anchor into these different buckets of outcomes, effectiveness, and efficiency. And all of those metrics, when we get them all in one place, they can inform us. They can tell us what's going on. We can decide we were going to monitor some of them because maybe they're not going in the direction we want them to go in. Maybe we ask and set up research questions like if X is happening, will it have an influence on Y and to what degree? So we can analyze and evaluate things, and then we can also use it to help us achieve more strategic issues with the organization or the clinical system. And then the way we present that information is really important because people ask for data all the time and then they don't use it. They don't look for it. Like they just got to get their hands on that spreadsheet. They just got to get their hands on participation rate. And then during an online course, and then all they care about is how many people completed the training. Okay. That's a different metric to follow. Okay. It tells you different information than looking at the component level of every module that's in there. All right. So those are the foundational kinds of metrics that are very useful to be following in your learning and development system. You sign up for a learning consult. I'm happy to talk through that with you and also brainstorm. I helped brainstorm with people over the last couple of weeks where they've got some data that they can't really put their finger on, or they've got data they're collecting and they really aren't sure what to do with it. And that's going to be all of that information. Those measures are then what really get you to a place where you can actually assess what's going on. Okay. And so some of those starting points are to ask, what measures do we have? What are we already collecting? What could we easily get? Things that are automated, but maybe we don't have direct access to, or somebody else has access to. All right. How are those data getting reported? Like I said earlier, if you don't have them, if they're not getting reported, the best place to start is with a scorecard. At least you know what metrics are available to you. Do you have established benchmarks for those? Sometimes you have benchmarks for some measures and not for others. And the benchmarks that you do have are for metrics that don't change often. Okay. So you can actually work toward that lagging measure very easily. Okay. You're just like waiting for doomsday to see if the metric changed. How are those data discussed and reviewed? Is it a report that somebody just sends out? Is it like a report that somebody sends in an email and there's really no discussion about it except for if it comes up in a one-on-one? Or is it something where all the people who are going to influence these metrics sit down, look at the metrics, try to put a narrative to it to tell the story about what's going on and how we can change it? Okay. What's the cadence that we're reviewing those as, and what kinds of decisions can we make based off of those data? All right. So those are some of the starting points around getting those metrics in place so you can take those metrics and then say, oh, we want to make this change. Or, oh my gosh, we thought our average number of training hours was 55, and actually it's 80 to 95, which is not unrealistic for many organizations. Those hours, they just tick on by and they run away from you, and then you have no idea what's happening. And then when you look at a summary financial report, that's when people start getting concerned about training, because now they're seeing the cost associated with it. That's a bad time to get concerned about training, is when money's involved, because at that point it's too late. All right. You need to be looking much earlier at all of these different aspects. And then not only looking at efficiency, which is what a lot of people want to do, they want to take an efficiency metric, pair it with a financial metric, and then have some answer. But look at efficiency and effectiveness, because at some point, the effectiveness measure, even if you don't think it's influencing the financial metric, it absolutely is. Okay. There's nothing that's happening in efficiency and effectiveness related to training that isn't going to impact treatment at some point. Okay. Everything is a treatment decision. It's not just an administrative decision. It's a treatment decision. Okay. So these are some of the starting points. Now, there are some other things you can do that can be very helpful, that can help you build more of a narrative around how all these metrics come together. One of them is collecting a training diary. And a lot of people we've talked to, and as people have signed up for the webinar, we've seen that a number of you are from smaller and mid-sized companies where you aren't bringing in such a volume of text per month that you couldn't be doing some of these things to get the narrative. Okay, you might be bringing in a handful every month or every quarter. And so a training diary is where you synthesize a lot of information and put it in the story, kind of like a day in the life of how a tech goes through their training journey. And I put a screenshot on here from a guy named Alexander Cowan. He's a product developer and faculty member at UVA. He doesn't work in ABA, but he's got some fabulous tools on like design thinking and product development. And one of the tutorials he has is on developing a day in the life, telling a complete story, and then attaching metrics to it. And so this would be like saying, here, we've got this cohort of technicians coming in. We're going to track them closely as they go through our training process so we can learn about how our training's performing. Okay. So in that day in the life, we capture field notes about their experience with training. We go in and observe them in training. How are they doing? What's working? What isn't? How many opportunities they have to actively participate? Are they struggling in any points in training? Can they not get logged into their practice management platform? That's a big one. Okay. So they are easily frustrated. They have low frustration threshold. Okay. And so they get frustrated. They don't get through the rest of training. Now it's delayed. Now the whole sequence is off. Okay. But we didn't know that. The office manager may have known that, but not everybody who's making decisions about the training system knows that. Okay. That's the problem. It's not that people don't know some of these things. It's not the right people who are making decisions don't always know these things. So the training diary would capture all of that, and you can connect qualitative insights, things that they tell you or things that you observe them, your field observations. You can collect those with the timestamps and the other metrics that I just talked about, those kind of quantitative metrics. All right. Put them together and synthesize them into a narrative. And the narrative can be used for a lot of things. It can tell you about whether or not you're using the right quantitative metrics, whether you need to make some adjustments there. The narrative can tell you what should we add or remove from our reports and from our dashboards. Maybe we don't need 170 metrics on a dashboard. Maybe we can look at 4 metrics, and those 4 metrics are highly correlated with people's onboarding experience. And so we can monitor those and make decisions based off of those. Okay. The training diary and story can help you do that. Then there are a lot of qualitative methods. Sometimes behavior analysts steer clear of these. Not so much that I don't think that they find them useful methods. I think that they just don't have experience implementing these methods. There are a lot of resources out there on facilitating focus groups or one-on-one interviews. Focus groups are where you have guided conversations in small groups where you focus on a shared experience or perspective about something. So you might have a group of level 1 techs. You may have another focus group with senior techs who are working alongside those new hires. And so when you're, say, launching a new training model, you may host several listening sessions or focus groups where you have a semi-structured interview of questions you want to ask, but the participants really drive it. And then after you've gathered that information, you can conduct a thematic analysis. You can look for the main themes that people bring up, and then we can flag those of things we want to go out and do other observations and attach our direct observation with, we want to maybe gather more insights from, or sometimes a focus group participant, especially someone who's mad. Usually someone who's mad or angry about an experience they had in a focus group, they are great to ask for a follow-up interview because they've got a lot of insights and they're not afraid to share them. And that's the kind of information you want to get, okay? Then there are those one-on-one interviews where you sit down with somebody, you may dive into just more about their personal experience in the training process. Those insights, again, are helpful because you can make a lot of changes about structure, sequencing, kinds of experience touch points, where to put those touch points, those types of things. Open-ended surveys, which I talked about before, field observations. That's actually going in and doing direct observation, making notes about that, taking structured notes, using and synthesizing that with other information to make some decisions. Cognitive task analysis. I'm totally out of time, so I won't get through any of these. But cognitive task analysis is where you have a trained performer go through some sort of task they're supposed to complete and essentially do a talk aloud. Ask them questions about what they were thinking, why they made decisions, what they expected, where did they get stuck. The reason that procedure can be very helpful is because not always will you know when people aren't talking aloud what they're doing or why they're doing it. You'll only see the permanent product or outcome of it. And actually, their whole decision-making process, even if it was wrong, can tell you a lot of information. And if nothing else, it could be a great non-example in training. Debriefs, which we briefly talked on, and I think we're going to have a whole webinar on how to set up structured debriefs after you do like a training, a simulation, and overlap a session. Journey mapping, which there's a resource I'll put in the resource list. That resource on journey mapping can help you figure out how to create one for your training and map your metrics to that so that they tell a story along the sequential path of coming in as a new hire. And incident report data. You probably have quantitative metrics from number of reports that were submitted or types of reports that were submitted and types of actions that you took and how you closed those cases. But often the details of an incident report, the narrative portion, is where you learn a lot of information that can be helpful for training, okay? Now, as I had with my last webinar, I have 5 more really useful strategies, I think, that I didn't get through in here. So I will put those slides in there in the resource list, and then put it both in the slides and some of the resources that go with it on how to do work product reviews, video recorded competencies, free writes or free says, clinical diaries, and then verbal behavior checks. And what I hope, even though I'm not able to get through all of that in this hour, is that you'll start to think about the metrics that you do have, the ways that you're using them or not using them, the metrics that you could get, the ways you could now bring that information all together, surface it all together, bring a bunch of decision makers together to have conversations and not just talk about, oh, I have this technician and they're doing really poorly in X, Y, or Z, so I think we should make these changes when 3.0 comes out, but actually use those measures to really drive the decision making. All right. And then anchor those into reports so that you as a training leader are bringing really valuable insights that are not just, oh, we trained 100 people this year, but we trained people. Here are the metrics that we know are being correlated with important clinical and business outcomes. And when you start tying those together, you can make some really big impact for the organization. I hope that this has been helpful to you. I hope you've picked up something, if not anything else, that framework that comes from the ROI Institute and a way to think about and conceptualize some of this. Again, we're trying to do monthly webinars, so stay on our LinkedIn and Facebook pages and also connect with us on our newsletter. And again, we're launching our 3.0 40-hour training, which we're happy to help organizations from small all the way to large size figure out how this training can fit into their training systems. And that's being launched at the end of August. So you're just in time to do some discovery about how all those elements fit together. And thank you so much for joining us and being part of this mission to not only implement the 3.0 changes, but to do it with enough care around the quality that these changes and the impact these changes could have for your organizations, the technicians that you are working with, and the learners that they serve. So hopefully this has been useful to us, and stay connected with us. We're so happy to have you here. Thanks so much, everybody.